Iraq and Afghanistan. Soldiers call it the sandpit, but it ain't no game. British and American forces are fighting their fiercest contacts since World War II. In this series, I'll be telling the hero stories, acts of courage and bravery that are mostly unknown, until now. In this episode, I'll be discovering how men under fire are inspired to extraordinary acts of courage. We'll be finding out how, in Afghanistan, a combined force of Royal Engineers and Royal Marine Commandos built fortifications under fire.
You could lose your life doing something like this. This is the real thing.
And in the same country, a corporal risked his life to keep an entire battle group on the move.
All those RPGs and those small arms fire, you could hear them whizzing past you. You're just thinking, what am I doing here?
And how an elite British trooper jumped straight into trouble to save a Danish soldier. And a US sergeant who held off a company of Iraqi special forces at the Battle of Baghdad in April 2003. It doesn't get tougher than this. I'm Andy McNabs, and this is my tour of duty. Any tour of duty is a challenge. As an SAS trooper for 10 years, I went through the highs and the lows that come with active service. Some of the stuff I did, some of the stuff I've seen, means I can never reveal my identity. I also learnt some important lessons. Lessons like how desperate situations can make heroes out of ordinary soldiers. Courage is a really hard thing to quantify in a soldier. And, you know, I've seen people do extraordinary things. They know they've got to get up, they know they've got to get forward and take the firefight to the enemy. Now, in a soldier's own words, and using incredible unseen footage shot by them, along with our own detailed reconstructions, this is Courage Under Fire. November 2006, the town of Geresh in southern Helmand province. British forces, including 4-2 Field Squadron Royal Engineers, traded punches with the Taliban for control of the town.
Oh, no. Tell your lads to keep looking out to the left! Sniper fire coming down!
Geresh had been really out of control for some months. The local bazaar had closed. Local people couldn't go about their business. The Taliban were coming in every night. They were bribing people. They were threatening people.
The market town had once been the thriving trading centre for the whole province, but now fierce fighting had reduced it to a ghost town.
In order to get some semblance of security, you need some sort of structure that you can maintain, that you can guard, and so you can get a foot on the ground.
The British forces and their Afghan allies needed permanent fortified positions and roadblock checkpoints. In Afghanistan and Iraq, the British Army make hardened defensive positions with giant HESCO bastion containers filled with sand and rubble. As this unique test footage shows, HESCO bastion defences can withstand anything from RPG fire to suicide vehicle strikes. Go to any coalition base in Iraq or Afghanistan and it'll be surrounded by HESCO bastions. These things are just the world's biggest sandbags and they're fortified by galvanised steel. And they were originally designed as flood defences. And certainly I've been taking indirect fire in Palace Barracks, which was in the centre of Basra at that time, and literally been sitting between 4 HESCOs, taking constant rocket and mortar fire, just sitting there drinking tea, because you know you're not going to get hit. These improvised strongpoints would give the defenders control of the town perimeter. If you want to secure any area, wherever you are, the best way is to put vehicle checkpoints out on every route in and out. So you can check vehicles and you can check people that are on foot.
The operation went in November, and the theory was that we'd improve the Afghan National Police Force infrastructure during the winter to give them better protection when the Taliban came down the following summer.
The problem was, in order to build the necessary fortifications, the sappers needed the fighting to stop. But in order to get the fighting to stop, they need the fortifications. Classic catch-22. The only way forward was to crack on and build the security points in full view of Taliban forces. First in would be a team of Royal Marine Commandos to seize the ground. Only then could the Royal Engineers move in and get building. Operation Slate was born.
The four to be built by the military construction force were the ones considered in the most dangerous of areas, and that was the plan for a military construction force to go into those more dangerous areas and build permanent vehicle checkpoints.
And the mission, the aim of it was to increase security or enhance security around the town of Gresh, particularly around the dam.
Before first light on the 6th of November 2006, the combined force of Royal Engineers and Royal Marine Commandos moved into position. This footage was shot by a Royal Marine as his company moved out into enemy territory. But it's hard to maintain the element of surprise when you're trundling along in a bunch of heavy plant machinery. There can't have been a soul in Helmand Province who didn't know what was going on that day.
We knew we was going into a Taliban-known area where they operated from. So as soon as we had left the camp, they knew where we was going.
The company that were patrolling Goresh were receiving contact almost on a daily basis. Every time they went out, they were receiving small arms or mortar fire.
We went, in the end, for to coin a military piece of terminology, bags of smoke and straight up the middle, i.e. we deployed from Fob Price straight through the middle of Goresh and onto the ground as quickly as possible without anybody realising what we were up to.
Initially, we couldn't actually deploy the engineer assets to the ground due to the heavy rate of fire. The Royal Marines deployed with their Vikings and got a foothold on the ground, providing the force protection so the engineer assets could actually get out on the ground from there.
We had the standard range of assets and equipment you'd expect in a commando company. A sort of fire support troop equipped with Javelin, so an anti-tank system, .5 medium caliber, large caliber machine guns, and I had some snipers as well.
The Viking all-terrain vehicle was the heaviest bit of kit available to the Royal Marine teams. The Viking's punch is provided by either a heavy machine gun or, even better, the awesome 40mm grenade machine gun. Want to know more? It's time for McNabs basic training.
I'm here today with 3 Commando Brigade, and what you can hear in the background, that awesome sound that's kicking off now, is some of the heaviest weaponry they're going to take into the field with them. And that is the 40mm grenade machine gun. It fires these things out. When one of these lands, anything in a 5-metre radius is dead. It's as simple as that.
Hey, listen, no, on!
Just think about it when, you watch a Second World War film, you've got a guy crawling up to the bunker and throwing in 1 grenade. This thing will throw out 320 of these a minute up to a distance of 2 kilometres. This weapon, without a doubt, is state-of-the-art. There's nothing that's going to better it for years to come. And they've been deployed into places like Afghanistan for our troops to get good, sustained fire down on the enemy so they can then carry out their attacks or extract. You can see how accurate the weapon is. Because you're firing at such a long distance, you're going to need optic sights. This thing's got it. You can put on night sights, thermal imaging sights, day or night. This thing's going to work. Imagine 320 of these coming down, even into, half a football pitch. Anybody in that area, well, they're dead. It's as simple as that, and that's why it's a good bit of kit, and that's why our army's using it. This is the best. It's great. With Royal Marine firepower like the 40mm GMG on the ground, the sappers were ready to rumble out of fob price.
We were expecting to be ambushed en route. There's only one route available because of the size of the plant, which means that you can't go down back streets. So as soon as we had left the camp, it was recognised that they knew where we was going.
Dangerous missions like Operation Slate brings out the best in keyed-up soldiers.
There's a feeling of sort of excitement, sort of, you know, trepidation, even a little fear. There's no sort of set way of feeling about things, because what people forget is that first and foremost, well, they're soldiers. You know, nobody's forced them to be there. You know, nobody's press-ganged them into this situation. They're volunteers. If they don't like it, they can always get out. But they don't get out because they enjoy what they do.
Any lingering hope of a quiet day's work vanished as the first round fizzed through the air. This incredible footage was shot by 4-2 Commando Battle Group as they arrived on the ground.
They must have known we were there because there's small arm fire coming across, so whizzing above our heads, so I had to take cover pretty much straight away as soon as we got into sight.
Nothing motivates you more to get on with the job than taking incoming. First of all, you're starting to hear the crack as the round exits the rifle, and then the thud sometimes as it buries itself about a foot into the ground. That's a big incentive to go on.
The Royal Engineers are used to doing their job under fire. The engineers traced their royal service to the wars of William the Conqueror, and they played a major role in every major conflict since. During World War I, the engineers took centre stage as both sides dug fortifications that stretched from the Channel to the Swiss border. Their distinguished service record continued in the Second World War. Combat engineers were usually the first into the line of fire as they crossed rivers, breached defences and neutralised minefields.
The work of sappers has changed to what they're doing now in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is pretty much, you know, trying to focus on reconstruction and development. Before that reconstruction and development happens, you've got to have security.
Back on the ground at Op Slate, the sappers of 4-2 Field Squadron were getting on with providing security to the town of Goresh. And now the threat increased as the first mortars hit the sites.
I think the threat became very real when the mortars started. As the Taliban mortar fire controllers were closing in, to the point where it became very, very clear that the Royal Engineers on site were the target. And as the mortars got closer and closer...
To begin with, there's a bit of adrenaline, because it jolts you, it makes you think that this is real, you know what I mean? And it just makes you work faster.
I've done exercises where we've been at overhead covering fire, where the rounds are coming from you to cover you, and they're cracking over your head, but the sensation of having someone firing at you is a bit different. It's survival takes over for a little bit, and then training kicks in. You just react.
As engineers, you can't just stop working and think, oh, I'm put tools down, I can't do this. We've just got to keep going, if you know what I mean.
I think, to be honest, the first 1 or 2 mortars that come in, it was like, you know, having a look around thinking, wow, you know, this is pretty close. Let's just get this done and let's get out of here as quick as possible.
An awful lot of the soldiers from the regiment had never been on operations before. They'd certainly not been in close contact with the enemy. So to put them for a 48-hour period into a position where they're taking incoming small arms, they're taking incoming mortars, they got on with their job just like any soldier has got on with his job in history.
Physically, obviously, you carry out your IO drills as you're trained to do. You go to ground and you're literally burying a hole with your helmet. The mental side of it is pure adrenaline, and your professional training just carries you through, and as Royal Engineers we just crack on with our jobs.
The creeping barrage of mortars was closing in. The accuracy and intensity of the Taliban mortar fire was threatening the entire operation. It was decision time.
The people giving close support actually decided it was getting too close and started to pull out.
It was only a matter of time before a mortar actually landed on one of the positions we were building, or actually landed in the close vicinity to do harm on one of the soldiers.
But sappers, ever mindful of the fact that if they stopped, that might stop the whole operation, and the key to it was completing the operation. They just cracked on going.
These lads are up front, knocking stuff together under fire, and that takes balls. So I've got nothing but admiration for the Royal Engineers, but obviously you don't tell them that, you just give them a hard time.
But what was particularly impressive from a Royal Marine point of view was that throughout this period, the engineers just carried on with what they were doing. Well, I was in a hole in the ground, holding on to my head, carrying at the bottom of the trench, because we were receiving incoming fire, and I would look up and the engineers would still be carrying on with what they were doing, and we were mightily impressed with how they did that.
We talked about it in the orders beforehand that, you know, we may take casualties, but construction will continue. And the OC made the call that we would go over there and bolster the troop, because the troop were just cracking on.
So Mick Raper and Major Mark Budden set off on their morale-boosting mission. They arrived on the ground to witness for themselves the combat conditions.
My sergeant major was point man, taking the lead, and a mortar landed about 10 to 15 metres away.
We obviously all lit the deck and then moved into a ditch which was to our right-hand side, followed by a little bit of nervous laughter, saying, you know, Jesus, that was close.
There is nervous laughter because that's primarily how the British Army deal with extreme fear. It's almost a survival mechanism, how the British Army deal with sort of extreme cases of violence and danger.
But then we realised that actually sat in a ditch waiting for the next mortar to fall was pretty pointless, so we got up and moved off.
But something had to be done about the Taliban mortar teams jeopardising the entire operation. This was a job for the two Royal Marine Force protection teams who had seized the ground that morning.
The protection of the site was done by two companies, Whiskey Company, my company, on the north of the canal, and J Company from 42 Commando on the south of the canal.
They were very protective of their sappers. They realised quite early on that the more support that we got as sappers, the quicker we would build and the less time they would spend on the ground. So they wanted to take care of any sort of Taliban activity.
The first direct challenge presented itself early. At about 9 a.m, the security cordon was breached. Armed Taliban fire controllers were spotted between the Marine Force Protection and the Royal Engineers. They opened fire on the commandos and Afghan forces.
They engaged actually my company HQ position with direct fire.
People took cover and then took returning fire.
They killed a member of the Afghan National Police, tragically, and wounded another one, a second member of the Afghan National Police.
At that point, there was a series of everything from small arms, underslung grenades, anti-armour weapons used against that contact.
We eliminated that threat, basically using snipers and mortar.
Taking out the Taliban fire controllers didn't silence the threat. More mortars rained in on the building site. A radical solution was called for to protect the engineers on the ground: air power.
We also had forward air controllers who could call in Apache helicopters, which were on task overhead. And then the final call is to bring in fast air and 500-pound bombs.
You sort of heard the fast air coming in. They dropped the 3 500-pound bombs. You saw it before you heard it, and saw the immediate sort of mushroom cloud of the 500-pound bomb had on that building and surrounding location.
But despite the massive firepower of the 500-pound bombs, some of the mortar teams survived. After a brief pause, more rounds pinged off the metal tractors and mortars pounded the site.
That is the biggest motivation to get something done, because if you don't do it, you could die, you know what I mean? And basically people just want to get out of there.
But of course, if we don't crack on with our job, we're there for longer, and it's putting more people's lives in danger. So the quicker we get finished, the quicker everybody can get out of there.
Conditions on the ground were getting grim. By midday, the sun was scorching down as the temperatures climbed into the mid-30s.
The boys were working in full kit. It was obviously very hot, it was very dusty, there was plant machinery moving around, moving the earth to fill the HESCO bastion. But we'd made that call early on in the orders and in the sort of planning that we would carry out it in full protection.
Most of the young soldiers, they'd never sort of worn body armour, helmets, full scales to go into war in, so it was a bit of a shock physically to the system to be operating in that intense heat.
As the light began to fail, work was nearing completion on the first 4 fortified checkpoints. The Afghan National Police started to take up their positions, and the Ops Slate lads pushed on into the night to get the final checkpoint done.
The AMP were sort of climbing in the Sangers literally as we were just doing the finishing touches to them.
Sort of 12, 13, 14 hours into the op, where the boys had been working solid, without break, with all their kit on. At the end of the operation, we had to run along and wake all the plant ops up in the cabs because they're all, zonked out, fast asleep.
Finally, at 1900, on 7th of November, the 5th and final vehicle checkpoint was complete, and the lads were ready to bug out. This footage, shot by a member of 4-2 Commando Battle Group, shows the scene that evening.
The area where we built these checkpoints had been overrun by the Taliban on a number of occasions in the preceding weeks, and they were, to my knowledge, never overrun again.
Marketplace opened in Goresh, and Goresh started functioning again. So, the impact was there for all to see, and certainly next time we drove through Goresh, there was a marked difference. Just the fact that normal life, or as normal as it was at the time in Goresh, had started to return.
The lads of 4-2 Field Squadron were absolutely knackered, but proud of what they'd achieved. They'd built 5 hardened checkpoints in under 40 hours, all done whilst being shot at, mortared and rocketed.
Everybody that I met that was involved in the operation on that day had just the best things to say about their bravery. The soldiers of today are just as brave as the British soldiers of the last couple of 100 years. They produce the goods on the day. They really, really do.
I think it'd be an understatement to say they were exhausted at the end, and certainly, throughout the night, the boys were really flagging, particularly the plant operators.
Extremely proud. It was good to see once it was done. Obviously, we didn't stay around to admire what we had done. We'd finished the job and we went on to our next job. So, yeah, it was good to see it finished and we're left with no casualties. Yeah, it was good.
But actually, the mindset of the sapper is he's a soldier as well. And the fact that he can do that under fire, in a bizarre way, they love it. If they wanted to go and build police checkpoints and not do it in the face of the enemy and not do it with the rest of the army, they would do that as a civilian. They could do that in Surrey. They could do that in Durham.
The defensive operation was a massive success, but sometimes the Royal Engineers have to show courage under fire on the attack. 7 months later, they had the chance to do exactly that. July 2007. British forces in Helmand province were looking to break into the green zone outside the town of Goresh.
Green zone was the large irrigated part on either side of the Helmand. Our main aim to get across there was to dominate the ground and push the Taliban out of that area.
Their way into the green zone was barred by 2 irrigation ditches and a wide canal. The lads of 30 Field Squadron Royal Engineers were tasked with getting the battle group into the green zone. Time was short. The engineers would need to create temporary bridges as quickly as possible to keep the attack's momentum.
Come on, pick it up!
Fascines were needed to cross the 3 obstacles, 2 small fascines and 1 large one.
A fascine is a series of big heavy-duty pipes, almost like drain pipes, but thicker. And what we do is we drop them in a hole, and that means vehicles can drive across it.
Armoured vehicles were brought up to carry the 2 small fascines for the irrigation ditches, but the large fascine was just too big. Only a digger would do.
The medium wheel tractor was the only vehicle available to us which could launch a fascine from the front rapidly.
Major Thompson needed a volunteer to drive the digger into danger. The task fell to Don Campbell, a 24-year-old corporal.
Well, when he first approached me, he said, well, he asked me if we could attach these fascines onto the bucket, and said, right, we'll give it a shot. And then he told me what the plan was. And then, well, I just said, that sounds good. Well, it's a good plan at the time.
His demeanour when I approached him about the plan was one typical of Corporal Campbell. It was an energetic, almost fiendish little grin that I know Don Campbell likes to give when he's excited about being given something to do.
I mean, Don's a typical sapper. You give him a task, he'll get it smashed in, and no questions asked.
But then I went back to him later and said, you do realise what I'm asking you to do? And there were others in the battle group coming to me saying, are you sure? My answer would be, how else do we do it? You tell me how else we do it. There is no other way. And there wasn't.
I joined the engineers in the year July 2000. I've been brought up in a croft back home. I was a welder and fabricator for a local contractor. I was mainly doing fisherman work. Back home, the work back home there wasn't much of it, and we could either do farming, fishermen, and that was really it.
Donald Campbell didn't hesitate to volunteer for the task, but I'm sure when he lay in his pit that night, he was thinking about all the things that could be going wrong the following day, but that didn't stop him getting up in the morning and getting on with that job.
The cover of darkness would be crucial to the success of the mission. In daylight, Don Campbell's medium-wheel tractor would be dangerously exposed to enemy fire. Battle Group South set off from Forward Operating Base Price on the evening of the 24th of July, 2007. But by the time the company got into position, the sun was beginning to light up the dawn sky.
Unfortunately, what happened in reality, the move took far longer. We attacked at first light, daylight.
The plan was unravelling quickly. If they decided to press on, Donald Campbell would be a sitting duck in his digger. But the alternative would be to abandon the whole attack. It was decision time.
We knew the risks he was taking, but it was more important to save the lives of the soldiers that wanted to cross that canal under fire. To delay the attack would have meant a failure of the whole operation.
The most difficult decision any commander has to make on the ground is one that may result in the death of his soldiers. But these decisions have to be made. That's the whole point of the chain of command. There's people on the ground, they've got the weapons, they need direction. That's why commanders have got to step back, have an overview and make those commands.
Major Rob Thompson took the decision to press on. Donald Campbell jumped into the cab of his digger and set off for canal crossing.
I was kind of escorted down by these two armour vehicles, the massive crew, and we were just heading down into the green zone.
The vehicles moved to both sides at the very last minute and allowed Corporal Campbell's tractor to push through to the canal. And it was at that moment, for a good 15-20 minutes, Corporal Campbell's tractor was exposed to enemy fire.
He obviously must have realised the only option was to put his foot down, and he kept going by himself onto the actual crossing. As soon as his vehicle hit the crossing, all hell opened up.
You can plan for everything, you can do contingency plans until they come out your ears. However, Terry Taliban isn't always going to do what you say. Best laid plans never survive contact with the enemy.
There was no going back now. Don Campbell was motoring right into the middle of the hornet's nest. Every Taliban weapon was targeting his big green digger. But help was at hand. Sergeant Kenny MacDonald was waiting at the crossing. This unique footage, shot by one of his platoon, shows him briefing his lads out on a recce in Helmand Province.
Well, the initial contact, they're not getting any more incoming from there. They reckon they've fucking slaughtered them. However, they're keeping eyes on north and east. And on the east, they're still getting incoming. He looked cracked earlier.
Don came around the corner, so I got his attention. He came up to me and dived out of his camp.
When I got to the canal, all of a sudden there was loads of fire happening. So I jumped out of the machine and started, well, I was taking cover behind the bucket. There was RPGs and there was a small arms fire. You could hear them whizzing past you. You're just thinking, what am I doing here?
The pressure was on as Kenny and Donald wrestled to get the fascine off the digger and into the ditch. There was only one way to do it, by hand.
The problem being it's got large straps on it, So we had to hide behind the bucket while the Taliban were firing RPGs at us. As you hear them zoom over, you hear the crack of rifle fire overhead. I just thought, bollocks, what are we going to do here? And the only thing we could do was get it into the gap. I remember giggling to him there. We're both giggling like schoolgirls like.
I've seen soldiers laugh in contact. They're actually in a contact, they're taking rounds, they're giving rounds back to the enemy, and they start laughing. You can't do anything about it, you just accept it. If it happens, it happens. You can't do anything about it. This incredible footage, shot earlier in the tour, shows Kenny MacDonald coming under fire for the first time. But back at the crossing, both men knew their situation was no laughing matter.
I was trying to do these ratchet shots, so under the ratchet shots, and taking cover again, I jumped into the machine and just pushed the scenes into this canal.
Once the straps were undone, Don got into his cab again, and he tilted his bucket, dumped it into the gap, and then pushed it in to make sure it was firmly in the gap.
Back on the hill overlooking the killing area was Staff Sergeant Palmer and Major Thompson. They could only watch in horror as the crossing point was hammered by Taliban fire.
Once the scene was into place, obviously the rounds were still going off. It was a little unclear to exactly what was happening with all the smoke and the fire.
As the RPGs and AKs hammered their position, it seemed impossible that MacDonald and Campbell could make it out alive.
And it was then reported to me that Corporal Campbell had been hit. The tractor is down, he's gone. But the Fasine was in. So at that particular moment, and for the next 40 minutes, I thought Corporal Campbell was dead.
There was a building a bit behind me, and you just reverse at speed and just hide behind this building, and then get out of the machine into the building to take cover from the rounds.
Once that was done, we extract back into the compound and have a nice cup of tea. Job done. It's only afterwards, when you're having a brew and chatting with your mates, that you realise just the sort of, crazy stuff you've done. That's when it sinks in. That's when you start, taking stock of what you've done.
Corporal Campbell then tracked his tractor back up to me and just said, "Yeah, boss, I'm here, I'm fine, no problem at all." I was extremely surprised to see him, and also very relieved too.
Once the crossing went in, that enabled the battle group to push forward into the green zone and driving the Taliban out.
The attack was a success. Donald Campbell won a conspicuous gallantry cross for his actions that day.
The Royal Engineers, they don't have the glamour of all the other regiments like the Parachute Regiment or the Royal Marines. But the fact is that the Royal Engineers are normally the first in to a battle to prepare the way for these regiments, and they're normally the last ones out. And they're not called combat engineers for nothing. Just look at the amount of decorations that they've earned in both Afghanistan and Iraq.
He knew exactly what he was doing, and it's for that reason he just fully deserves that award.
Donald's actions are a demonstration of the contribution that a single brave soldier can make to the course of a battle. American soldier Paul R. Smith is a typical example of the sacrifices that men make to save others. Sergeant First Class Paul R. Smith was a US sapper with the 3rd Infantry Division leading the push for Baghdad in March 2003.
Suddenly, the ground war has reached the suburbs of this city. What quite literally brought it home to people was the loss of electricity. Only airstrikes lit up the city. Using a night vision lens, our cameraman filmed missiles and bombs landing around Saddam International Airport, the vital objective for the coalition. John Irvine, ITV News, Baghdad.
12 days after the start of the war, the 3rd Infantry reached the outskirts of Baghdad and headed straight for the airport, despite the denials of Saddam's spokesman.
They are not near Baghdad. Don't believe them.
Are they trapped near the airport, sir?
Why not to take them to Saddam Airport? No, this is silly.
Task Force 27, 3rd Infantry, was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Scott Rutter.
Task Force 27 was given the mission in order to execute a blocking position at Baghdad International Airport.
This footage was recorded by Scott and his lads for Global TV News to prove that US forces were on the verge of taking Saddam's capital.
This is a sign that we're able to send to the residents of Baghdad that we're here, and they can rise up and deal with the regime appropriately.
The airport itself was a key strategic target. Rutter's lads took it with little resistance the day after his TV appearance. From there, Lieutenant Colonel Rutter pressed on into the city.
Senior officers felt that that we could seize the initiative, we can seize the moment to keep the Iraqi Special Republican off guards and strike hard to go into Baghdad, and we seized the moment.
Paul R. Smith's platoon of engineers was left behind at the airport to build defences and hold the fort. With the main force diverted away from the airport, Saddam's forces saw an opportunity to launch a massive counter-attack.
They have no control even on themselves. Don't believe them. Those invaders will be slaughtered.
On the morning of April 4th, an overwhelming force of approximately 150 enemy soldiers attacked.
Paul Smith's sappers were outnumbered 6-1 by elite Iraqi Republican guards. The Iraqis soon took the watchtower overlooking Smith's compound. Instinct must have told him to get out of there. Instead, he grabbed a few of his men and took the fight to the Iraqis.
Paul realized that he had to reposition his forces, to go to the sound of the guns, to recognize that if he didn't do it, that this force would have overwhelmingly attacked the combat trains at this point. And the combat trains, again, the medical aid station.
And certainly all soldiers, including myself, have had those experiences. All you want to do is find that hole, curl up and stay there till it's all over and done with. But you've got to get up. And you're going to die if you stay down. If you don't do your bit, in the group, in the patrol, they're going to die as well.
As Iraqi Special Forces began their assault on the compound gate, Smith's men tossed them a couple of hand grenades. His counterattack caught the assault force by surprise. He had bought his men precious time to get in position to defend the compound.
He realized that there were other vehicles that were within the combat trains that he could use to his advantage. The 113, the armored personnel carrier, as well as the Bradley fighting vehicle.
As the vehicles arrived in the combat zone, Smith fired an AT-4 anti-tank weapon to slow the Iraqi advance. The combined firepower of the Bradley and the M113 hammered the enemy. But then the Bradley ran out of ammo, and the M113 was hit by an RPG. The crew had to be evacuated under fire. The Iraqis regrouped and attacked again. In a final act of desperation, Smith grabbed one other man and ran out into full view of the enemy to the smoking armoured personnel carrier. Isolated and alone, the two men leapt aboard the 113. Smith seized control of the 50 cal machine gun.
If Paul Smith hadn't jumped up in the 113, I think that our combat trains, the medical aid station, would have been overrun.
Smith's suppressive fire bought his unit enough time to regroup and encircle the tower. The Republican Guard assault force was crushed. But it came at a price.
Paul Smith died in the 113 behind the 50 caliber machine gun engaging the enemy. Soldiers attempted to revive him and take him to the aid station, but unfortunately he died and expired during that time frame.
Smith's actions swiftly became part of his unit's legend, but his commander was determined that his heroism would reach a much wider audience.
We realized that we had history there, that we decided that this needed to be done right now, that it was important for soldiers, our children, and the American people and the world community in order to see the sacrifices and the efforts of our young men and women in Iraq.
After he left the army, Scott became a regular military expert and combat reporter for TV News. He used this platform to campaign for Paul R. Smith's actions to receive due recognition.
Recognizing the value that I had of potentially going into the media for actually talking about his event, to make sure that every time that I was on television, to make sure that I spoke about Sergeant First Class Paul Smith.
The years of tireless campaigning finally paid off on the 4th of April 2005. 2 years to the day after his death, Smith's family went to the White House to receive the Medal of Honor on his behalf.
When Sergeant First Class Paul Smith was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, it was awarded by the Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States, on April 4th, 2005, during a White House ceremony.
The Medal of Honor is the highest award for bravery a president can bestow. It is given for gallantry above and beyond the call of duty in the face of enemy attack. From a completely exposed position, Sergeant Smith killed as many as 50 enemy soldiers as he protected his men. Sergeant Smith's leadership saved the lives of more than 100 American soldiers. Scripture tells us, as the general said, that a man has no greater love than to lay down his life for his friends. And that is exactly the responsibility Paul Smith believed the sergeant stripes on his sleeve had given him.
In my mind, his legacy demonstrates the commitment, the valor, the uncommon bravery of the young American soldiers, uncommon bravery that needs to be recognized for the rest of my life and our lives.
Extreme danger brings out the best in the best. It inspires men and women to do extraordinary things in defence of the soldiers standing next to them. Lance Corporal Mark Wilson is an outstanding example. July 2006, Musakala, southern Afghanistan. A 26-man patrol of elite British pathfinders move into the disputed town to hold the fort.
We were sent into Musakala to take it over from the Americans again for 96 hours. We could sense from speaking to the locals the Taliban weren't happy with us being there.
The pathfinders' new home immediately came under savage and sustained attack. Things then got even worse. The Free Para Relief Force were pinned down in their own fight to the death. As this incredible combat footage shows, they had more than enough on their own plate in nearby Sangin. Back in Musakala, the pathfinders were all alone, apart from the occasional air support.
We're reconnaissance soldiers meant to be out, in our jeeps, driving around the desert, finding the enemy, not stuck in one location, waiting for the enemy to come to us.
The Pathfinders were formed in 1942. Their job, to insert behind enemy lines ahead of airborne assaults to locate and mark landing zones. Now a reconnaissance asset of 16 Air Assault Brigade, they remain one of the toughest and most elite of all British combat units. The battle for Musakala was proving to be yet another chapter in their already awesome legend. With Free Power out of the picture, a local force of Danish infantry was sent to relieve the beleaguered Pathfinders.
I was part of a Danish advance party. We flew in with a British Chinook helicopter.
The British and Danish defenders were outnumbered 10-1 by the Taliban. This footage, shot by one of the Danes, shows the intensity of the battle for Musakala. The stage was set for one of the most heroic actions of the whole British involvement in Afghanistan.
2 Danes were on sentry duty, overlooking basically the bazaar. It'd been a very quiet day, and I was basically just cleaning my rifle, doing the sort of normal soldiery stuff, and we heard there was just 2 large bangs.
The initial contact was 2 RPGs fired. The second one actually went through an opening in the side of the outpost.
I remember falling through rubbles and bricks and stones, trying to get a grip of something, but I just went through the roof, through the floor, hitting the ground and being totally disorientated.
The RPG strike triggered a massive Taliban assault on the compound. This footage was filmed the next day as attacks rolled from one into the next. Thomas Rydell was lying 2 stories down, exposed to Taliban forces out in the street.
He was pretty much pinned down, and all he had with him was his pistol. He was pinned in a position where he couldn't really, fire onto the Taliban.
I was able to look out on the street. It just shook me that if I was able to look out, other people from the street must be able to look inside the room.
Thomas Rydell was moments away from being killed or captured by the Taliban. Someone had to do something fast to save him. That someone was Corporal Mark Wilson.
I actually used the end of an old bunk bed, actually collapsed the end of it off and used that as a climbing frame.
All Mark Wilson knew was that he had to get down that hole, get this Danish soldier out, and all he could find was a bed. So that's what he used.
There were bedsteads listed all over the position because the Afghans liked to sleep where they would fight from, and he hung it at an angle so that it had enough grip. He was able to hang and then jump off down into Thomas.
He let go and just fell into the room. And my first reaction to that was relief.
Well, initially just looked in the area of the Taliban, fired a few rounds in their direction from Thomas's pistol.
The firefight was still raging above, but two of the Pathfinders managed to find a ladder in the main compound building.
At this point, I've been in that room for about half an hour, so I was very nervous and I just wanted to get out of there, basically.
Pretty much put him on my shoulder, climbed out the ladder, and at the top of the ladder threw him onto the roof itself.
Mark Wilson didn't think twice about jumping into danger to save a Danish soldier he'd only met a couple of days before.
There's a bond between soldiers. It's a job unlike any other, where you've got guys going out in the field with the possibility of getting killed. They understand each other, whether you're a British soldier, an American soldier, a Danish soldier, it doesn't matter. But it's that bond that makes somebody get up, run into fire, to grab hold of another wounded man, whoever they are, to bring them back.
I think it was pretty much purely all just instinct. It's just a natural reaction. You don't think twice about it, and you crack on.
Thomas Rydell and a British soldier also injured during the firefight were evacuated from Musakala by Black Hawk helicopter. Thomas has made a full recovery and is living with his young family back in Denmark.
Yeah, I owe him a lot.
Mark Wilson's outstanding bravery was recognised with a military cross.
Mark Wilson, a very dedicated soldier, enthusiastic, fit, strong, and he's just very brave. It's a pleasure to have a guy like that in your unit.
Whatever you think about the rights and the wrongs of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, these are soldiers' wars. In this series, I've brought you just some of the stories you don't hear. What it's like to fight, to see your mates die, what courage is all about. What the soldiers are doing is remarkable. It's history in the making.